My husband left me waiting alone at a fancy restaurant for over 3 hours on our anniversary. When he finally strolled in with his buddies, he laughed and said, "Told you she'd still be here, waiting like a loyal little puppy." They cracked up. I just smiled, ordered another drink, then quietly walked out. He missed call started once he realized I'd used his card to book myself a first-class flight to Paris. I, 34F, never thought I'd be writing this, but here I am, 3 weeks after what I now call the anniversary that changed everything. My marriage of 8 years ended not with a fight or tears, but with a smile and a first-class ticket to Paris. The day started normally enough. I'd spent weeks planning our anniversary dinner at Le Bernardin, the same restaurant where we'd had our first date. I'd made reservations months in advance, bought a new dress, and even took the afternoon off work to get ready. I was excited. We'd been going through a rough patch, and I thought this might be the perfect opportunity to reconnect. I arrived at the restaurant at 7 sharp, just as we'd agreed. The hostess seated me at our usual table by the window, and I ordered a glass of wine while I waited. 7:15 came and went. Then 7:30. I texted him asking if he was running late, but got no response. By 8 o'clock, I was starting to feel embarrassed as other couples were seated, ordered, ate, and left while I sat there alone. The waiter kept checking on me, his expression growing more sympathetic each time. I told him my husband was just running late from work, that he'd be there any minute. But as the minutes turned into hours, that excuse started sounding hollow even to me. I ordered another glass of wine, then another, trying to maintain some dignity while other diners shot me pitying glances. By 9:30, I was furious. Not just angry, I was humiliated. I'd called him 6 times, sent a dozen texts, and even called his office. Nothing. I was seriously considering leaving when I heard his laugh from across the restaurant. That familiar, booming laugh that used to make me smile, but now made my stomach clench with dread. I turned around, and there he was, walking in with 3 of his buddies from work. They were all clearly drunk, stumbling slightly, and talking loudly enough that other diners were staring. My husband spotted me immediately and pointed in my direction, saying something to his friends that made them all burst into laughter. They approached the table, and I could smell the alcohol on them from 3 feet away. My husband looked at me sitting there with my empty wine glasses and the untouched bread basket, and instead of apologizing, he turned to his friends with the biggest grin I'd ever seen on his face. He told them he'd bet them $50 each that I'd still be sitting there waiting for him, no matter how late he showed up. He called me his loyal little puppy, said I was so predictable and desperate for his attention that I'd wait all night if necessary. His friends found this hilarious, slapping him on the back and making jokes about how whipped I was. I sat there for a moment, processing what I'd just heard. This wasn't just him being late or inconsiderate. This was deliberate. He'd planned this humiliation, turned our anniversary into entertainment for his drinking buddies. He'd bet money on my devotion, treated my love like a joke. But instead of making a scene, instead of crying or yelling like they'd probably expected, I just smiled. I picked up my wine glass, took a slow sip, and calmly asked the waiter for another drink. My husband and his friends seemed confused by my reaction, but they shrugged it off and started talking about heading to a bar. I waited until they were distracted, then quietly stood up and walked toward the restroom. But instead of going to the bathroom, I slipped out the side exit. I could hear them still laughing behind me as I stepped onto the sidewalk. The cool night air hit my face, and for the first time in hours, I could breathe properly. I stood there for a moment, thinking about what had just happened, about what my marriage had become. Then I pulled out my phone and did something I'd never done before. I opened our joint credit card app. We'd always kept separate accounts for personal expenses, but we had one shared card for big purchases and emergencies. I'd never used it without discussing it with him first. But as I stood there on that sidewalk, still wearing my anniversary dress and feeling the weight of 8 years of taking me for granted, I decided this qualified as an emergency. I booked the first flight I could find to Paris. First class, leaving the next morning. I'd always wanted to go to Paris, had mentioned it countless times over the years, but he'd always found excuses: too expensive, too far, too much trouble. Well, now I was going, and he was paying for it. The flight cost more than we usually spent in 3 months, but I didn't care. I added a week at a boutique hotel in the Marais district, the kind of romantic place I'd bookmarked years ago when I still believed we might travel together someday. I booked spa treatments, restaurant reservations, even a private tour of the Louvre. By the time I got home, I'd spent enough money to make a serious dent in our savings. I packed quickly, throwing clothes into a suitcase without much thought. I was running on pure adrenaline, fueled by years of suppressed resentment and the crystal-clear realization that my marriage was over. I left a note on the kitchen counter, short and to the point. I told him I'd gone to Paris and would be back in a week. I didn't explain why or apologize for the expense. I didn't ask him to call or promise to talk when I returned. I just stated the facts and left. The flight was scheduled for 10 a.m., which meant I needed to leave for the airport by 7. I set my alarm for 5, planning to get a few hours of sleep before my escape. But I needn't have bothered. I was too wired to sleep anyway. I was in the shower at 6 a.m. when I heard my phone buzzing incessantly from the bedroom. By the time I got out and checked it, I had 17 missed calls and 23 text messages. He'd finally realized I wasn't coming home. The messages started confused and slightly annoyed, asking where I was and why I'd left the restaurant. But as the night progressed and he'd apparently checked our credit card account, the tone shifted dramatically. The later messages were panicked, angry, then pleading. He'd figured out what I'd done and was demanding I cancel the trip immediately. He called me selfish and irresponsible, said I was having some kind of breakdown. He threatened to cancel the credit card, to call the airline, to do whatever it took to stop me from leaving. But it was too late. I was already in the Uber to the airport, watching the city wake up through the window as my phone continued to buzz with increasingly desperate messages. I turned it off somewhere around JFK and didn't turn it back on until I was sitting in a cafe in Montmartre 3 days later. Paris was everything I dreamed it would be. I spent my days wandering through museums and gardens, eating incredible food, and rediscovering who I was when I wasn't constantly trying to please someone who clearly didn't value me. I bought myself flowers from street vendors, sat in cafes for hours reading books, and had long conversations with strangers who didn't know anything about my failed marriage. For the first time in years, I felt free. I realized how much of myself I'd lost trying to make my husband happy, how small I'd become in my own life. The woman who'd sat waiting in that restaurant for 3 hours felt like a stranger to me now. When I finally turned my phone back on, I had over 100 messages. Most were from my husband, ranging from angry to apologetic to desperate. He'd apparently told his family and mine that I'd had some kind of mental breakdown and disappeared. He'd called my work, my friends, even filed a missing persons report before realizing I'd used our credit card in Paris. The most recent messages were different, though. He'd clearly talked to a lawyer, because he was now threatening divorce and demanding I return immediately to discuss our finances. He was furious about the money I'd spent, calling it theft and financial abuse. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd humiliated me for entertainment was now claiming to be the victim. I didn't respond to any of his messages. Instead, I extended my stay by another week and booked myself into a cooking class in Provence. If he wanted to talk about financial abuse, we could discuss 8 years of me paying for his hobbies while he dismissed mine as frivolous. We could talk about all the vacations he'd taken with his friends while telling me we couldn't afford a weekend getaway together. Update 1. I've been back for 2 weeks now, and the situation has escalated in ways I didn't expect. When I finally returned from Paris, I came home to find the locks changed and a note from a lawyer taped to the door. My husband had apparently decided that the best defense was a good offense. He'd moved out while I was gone and taken most of our shared belongings. The house felt empty and strange, like a museum of our former life together. But honestly, the silence was peaceful after years of walking on eggshells around his moods. The lawyer's letter was almost comical in its accusations. I was being painted as an unstable spouse who'd abandoned our marriage and stolen marital assets. The letter demanded I return the money I'd spent in Paris and threatened legal action if I didn't comply within 30 days. I spent that first day back just sitting in our empty living room, processing everything that had happened. The woman who'd sat waiting in that restaurant felt like someone from another lifetime. I couldn't imagine ever being that patient, that willing to accept such disrespect again. I called my own lawyer the next morning. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who listened to my story without judgment and then asked me one simple question. Did I want to save my marriage or end it? The answer came without hesitation. I wanted out. What followed was 3 months of the most exhausting legal battle of my life. My husband's lawyer painted me as a vindictive wife who'd stolen money and abandoned my marriage over a simple misunderstanding. They tried to make the Paris trip sound like evidence of mental instability, claiming I'd acted irrationally and impulsively. But my lawyer was better prepared than they expected. She'd done her homework on our financial history and discovered some interesting patterns. It turned out my husband had been spending significantly more than I'd realized over the years. Expensive dinners with colleagues, weekend trips with friends, even a motorcycle he'd bought and hidden at his brother's house. Update 2. The divorce was finalized last month, and I'm writing this from my new apartment across town. It's smaller than our old house, but filled with light and completely mine. I've decorated it exactly how I want, with bright colors and plants and books everywhere. It feels like home in a way our house never did. The settlement was fairer than I'd expected. My lawyer managed to prove that my husband's spending over the years far exceeded my Paris trip, and the judge wasn't impressed with his claims of financial abuse. We split our assets down the middle, and I kept my retirement account intact. The most satisfying part was when his lawyer tried to argue that I owed him compensation for the stolen money I'd spent in Paris. My lawyer calmly presented evidence of every expensive dinner, every boys' trip, every purchase he'd made, without consulting me over the past 5 years. The total was staggering, nearly 10 times what I'd spent on my week in France. My ex-husband's face when those numbers were read aloud was worth every penny I'd spent on legal fees. For the first time, he was seeing the concrete evidence of how one-sided our financial relationship had been. He'd been so focused on controlling the narrative about my irresponsible spending that he'd forgotten about his own patterns. The judge made it clear that my Paris trip, while expensive, was hardly grounds for the dramatic legal action my husband had taken. She noted that in 8 years of marriage, it was apparently the first time I'd made a significant purchase without his approval, while he'd been doing so regularly. But the real victory wasn't financial, it was personal. I'd proven to myself that I didn't have to accept being treated like a loyal little puppy. I'd shown that there were consequences for taking someone's love and devotion for granted. Update 3. It's been 6 months since the divorce was finalized, and I'm in a completely different place now. I've been promoted at work, partly because I'm no longer distracted by trying to manage my husband's moods and demands. I have energy for my career again, for friendships, for hobbies I'd abandoned years ago. I still think about that night at the restaurant sometimes, but not with anger anymore. It was the moment I realized I deserved better, the catalyst that changed everything. In a strange way, I'm almost grateful to my ex-husband for being so blatantly cruel that night. If he'd been subtler about his disrespect, I might have continued making excuses for him for years. I've been back to Paris twice since then, once with my sister and once alone. Each time, I remember that first trip, how scared and angry and desperate I felt, but also how alive. It was the first time in years I'd done something purely for myself, without considering anyone else's opinion or approval. My ex-husband tried to contact me a few months ago, apparently having some regrets about how things ended. He wanted to meet for coffee, to talk about what went wrong, maybe to see if we could work things out. I declined politely but firmly. Some bridges, once burned, should stay that way. I learned something important from this whole experience. That love without respect is worthless, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away. I spent 8 years trying to be the perfect wife for someone who saw my devotion as a weakness to exploit rather than a gift to cherish. Now I'm building a life where I'm not waiting for anyone's approval or attention. I make my own plans, book my own trips, and surround myself with people who value my time and presence. It's a smaller life in some ways, but it's entirely mine. The loyal little puppy he mocked that night? She learned to bite back, and then she learned something even better. She learned to walk away and never look back.